It's a deep privilege for me to be part of this summit. I've visited Kenya, I think, 3 times, and every time I've enjoyed the people, the wildlife, and the beauty of your country. The brief that has been given me today is to lay a biblical or theological foundation for our Christian political engagement. So without much ado, let me proceed. Okay, so the Church and Politics, Introducing Political Theology. And let me begin with some introductory cautionary remarks. When we think of politics, politics is much more than government. Politics is about power, the way that power is exercised, the way that power is distributed in any given society. So our Lord had much to say about power, even though he took no part in the government of his day, and he distanced himself from all the political parties of Palestine. And it's very interesting how those political parties, from the conservative Sadducees on the one hand to the revolutionary zealots on the other, saw Jesus as a political threat. In fact, they came together across their differences to get rid of this man. And the charge that was brought against Jesus at his trial was that he spoke against the temple, which was a symbol of Jewish national identity. And when they got him to be crucified by the Roman state, the placard that was placed above the cross was that he was the King of the Jews, satirically. So he was condemned and crucified as a political criminal, an insurgent against the Roman state. Now, there are many Christians who down the ages have followed Jesus in, while standing apart from active governmental roles, have still exercised prophetic political leadership. Just in the last century, think of famous names like Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, or the Reverend Martin Luther King in the USA, or Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa. These were people who, on behalf of their Christian congregations, gave political leadership to the whole of society. The other cautionary remark that I would make is that, Africa, you in Africa have a very rich Christian history, stretching back 2,000 years, the beginnings of Ethiopian Christianity, and then some of the great theologians of the church like St. Augustine or Tertullian or Cyprian, who helped the church down the ages think Christianly about the relationship between the church and the state. They were all Africans. But Africa has also seen, like many other continents, the abuse of the Bible by many Christians. In the last 100 years, perhaps the most glaring examples have been the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 due to pressure from American and Christian fundamentalist groups who took Old Testament texts out of their context and pressurized British colonial administrators to create a Jewish home in Palestine, because they believed that that would signal the beginning of the last days and the return of Christ. Theodor Herzl, who was a founder of the Zionist movement, was originally thinking of Uganda as a possible home for the Jews. But pressure from Christian Zionists in the West, as well as people from within the Jewish Zionist movement, changed his mind. So Palestinians today constitute the largest refugee population in the world. They were subject to near genocide and this massive displacement in 1948. And then, of course, the second glaring example of the abuse of the Bible is from South Africa, where the Afrikaner Church took passages from the Old Testament that spoke of God desiring cultural diversity, and using passages calling on Israel to stay separate from other nations in its religious and social practices. They wrenched those texts out of their original context and taught that all races should develop separately. Blacks separately, white separately, and colored separately. So apartheid theology was a product of the misuse of the Bible. And then more widely, many Christian churches have given their support to brutal dictatorships in Africa, in Latin America, in some parts of Asia. They have sometimes used the passage from Romans 13 to argue that whatever government is in power, it has been put there by God, and we should therefore uncritically submit to it. Now, I will come back to Romans 13 a little bit later. But dictators know how to manipulate church leaders. To get the church on their side, all they have to do is promise church leaders that they will be given land to put up church buildings. They will crack down hard on Muslims and homosexuals, and the churches uncritically give these dictators their support. So we need to learn to use the Bible not in a childish way by just wrenching proof texts or isolated verses and then trying to develop political doctrines out of them. But we need a more sophisticated biblical hermeneutic. How do we read the whole Bible? How do we familiarize ourselves with 2,000 years of Christian reflection, including right here in Africa, Christian reflection on politics? So that is a challenge you face in Kenya and I face in Sri Lanka. So what does the theology of creation, which is foundational to all theology, have to say about politics? Well, the opening chapter of the Bible reminds us that the earth is our fellow creature, the home of us human beings. In fact, the word Adam literally means in Hebrew, the earthling. We didn't fall from the heavens like angels or aliens from outer space. We were created along with all the plants and animals from the soil of the earth. This is our natural home. And so the future of the earth and our future are interdependent. They're woven together. And climate change and the current pandemic has forcefully reminded us of our mutual dependence on each other. But although we human beings are part of the animal kingdom, yet we also stand apart. We are unique. We are transcendent animals. So we are embodied, self-conscious, relational selves or subjects, persons. We derive our being in and through and for relationships with God and with others. In the opening chapter of the Bible, we are told that mankind, male and female, are made in, or some translations put it, as the image of God on earth. What does this mean? Well, apart from indicating our unique relationship with God, remember that in the ancient world, whenever a king conquered a piece of territory, the first thing he would do was to erect an image of himself, made of either wood or stone or metal. That wooden or stone or metal image represented his authority, his sovereignty, his ownership of that particular piece of land. So what the Genesis writers tell us is that God does not have a human wooden or stone image that represents him. He has created flesh and blood human beings, not just Israelites, but all human beings, irrespective of color, of ethnicity, of age, of sex, of sexual orientation, of educational attainment, even moral behavior. Irrespective of all these, every human being is his image, representing God to the rest of creation. So it follows that how we treat our fellow human beings is a reflection of how we regard God. If somebody kicked or defaced that wooden or stone image of a king, he was rejecting the king's authority. He was rebelling against the king. And so the way that we treat our fellow human beings is an indication of who we truly worship, our attitude to God. So while we are relational and social beings, yet we have individual value, individual worth. And this, after all, is the basis of what we today call human rights. For human rights basically says that there are certain things we should never do to any human being anywhere simply by virtue of his humanity or her humanity. And there are certain things that we should do for every human being anywhere simply by virtue of his or her humanity. Now, it's because we human beings are created as God's representatives, as his image, that we are called to wise and caring government of the earth. We're called to exercise dominion, to rule the earth under God, with God, and as being accountable to God. And this is spelled out in Genesis 2, verse 15, where the garden is a symbol or a picture of the whole earth. And human beings are called to till the earth, that is, to cultivate, to develop the resources of the earth, and also to care for it, to keep the earth. In fact, the Hebrew literally means to serve the earth. So tilling and cultivating and developing the resources, and yet leaving for future generations an earth that is richer than we found it, not destroying the earth's life-sustaining and life-giving capacities. So while the earth and all the resources of the earth belong to God, not to governments, not to multinational corporations, we human beings are called to be stewards, responsible, wise governors, accountable to God for what we do with the earth. So like I said, the well-being of the earth and the well-being of human beings are interwoven. But we know that human beings are not content to be stewards, not even content to be made in God's image. We want to be gods. We want to be owners. We want to possess the earth and to possess and exploit other human creatures. Reinhold Niebuhr, a famous American public theologian, once put it, and this is a well-known quote from him, "Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary." Democracy understood here as recognizing the right of every human person to have a say in his or her governance or government. And it recognizes that when power is concentrated in the hands of just one person or a small group of persons, then that power is very easily abused. And so democracy acts as a check on power. But this presupposes that all human beings have had their basic needs met, that they are well informed, they are politically literate, they are not starving. And so this introduces then a tension between sustainable economic development and the practice of democracy. The French novelist Albert Camus writes in an essay called Bread and Freedom these words. He says, if someone takes away your bread, he suppresses your freedom at the same time. But if someone takes away your freedom, you may be sure that your bread is also threatened. For it depends no longer on you and your struggle, but on the whim of a master. So we shouldn't pit economic development against democracy, but work on them together, because there is a two-way, a dialectical relationship between the two. A certain measure of economic development is necessary. People's basic needs need to be met if democracy is to be viable and sustainable. But democracy is only possible, also enables such sustainable economic development to take place. And so the two must go hand in hand. Now, Israel rejected its vocation, its calling Israel was called, its vocation was to be, if you like, a light to the nations, And the way that Israel was to be a light to the nations was by practicing a new kind of economic, a new kind of politics, the land which was given to it. So Israel bore witness to God not by traveling around the Mediterranean world and preaching about God, by actually living a distinctive countercultural life. So attracting the surrounding nations to ask questions. Who is this God who has given you such laws? And then Israel tells a story of how Israel was found by God and liberated from slavery and genocide in Egypt. And in that way, Israel was called to bear witness to Yahweh. So let's look at just some examples very briefly of the new economics, the new politics that Israel was called to practice. Just think of the Sabbath. Every seventh day, compulsory rest or leisure for workers and also for domestic animals. One commentator has said that the Sabbath was the first workers' charter in human history. And then every seventh year, the land was to lie fallow, to allow the land to regenerate. You could call that an environmental charter. And then after every 7 times 7 years, every 50th year, there was a super Sabbath called the Jubilee, where land returned to its original owners. This was a way of preventing a few people from possessing, buying up all the land. So the majority of people lived as landless laborers, dependent on others for their subsistence. And so the Jubilee every 50th year was announced on the Day of Atonement, as God gave people their sins, released them from their debt of sin, or they released their neighbors from their economic debts and returned land to the original owners. This was the ideal. Sadly, it's very rare in practice in ancient Israel. There is a humming or a buzzing in the background. I'm not sure where that is coming from. So then you have also laws in the book of Deuteronomy about the cancelling of debt, about the freeing of slaves. Israel was called to free its slaves. They were not allowed to take slaves from amongst themselves, but if there were people from neighboring nations or prisoners of war who became slaves, every seventh year they were to be released. They were to be handsomely, generously compensated. And then there were these cities of refuge. So if a slave was treated harshly by his master or mistress, they could flee to these cities of refuge and enjoy personal, social, and legal protection. And then there's a very interesting section in Deuteronomy 16:18 to 18:22 that speaks of the various authorities in Israel. It speaks of what today we would call the separation of powers, because the first authority that is mentioned are not the kings, but the judges, because the judges were there to study and interpret the law of Moses, the Torah. That was foundational to the life of Israel. And then we come to the kings, the second political authority. And the king was expected to be a student of the law, that day and night he was called to study the Torah, to live under the rule of law. So this was, if you like, a constitutional monarchy. The king did not enjoy immunity from legal prosecution if he disregarded the law. The third category of authorities are the priests, the Levites. And their fundamental role was to teach the common people the law. And then you have the fourth category, which is the prophets. The prophets stand outside any sort of active role in the running of Israel, but they are the critics of all these other institutions. They remind the judges, they remind the kings, they remind the priests if they are straying away from God's law. So the prophets act, if you like, as the conscience of Israel, calling Israel back to its vocation, its mission. But we know how the story developed, because there were massive violations of God's law at every period of Israelite history. And you find this refrain that runs through the prophetic writings and through the Psalms: the poor, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien. They are the people who are most likely to be pushed to the wall whenever times get tough. And because God and his law has a bias towards the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the alien, so kings and those with power are to defend them particularly. And so the prophet calls the king to actually remember and to render justice to those who are most vulnerable, the weakest, the most defenseless. Notice Proverbs 31, speak out for those who cannot speak. This is addressed to the king. For the rights of all the destitute, speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Notice the language of rights, which are legal entitlements. So this is not about the kings and those in authority doing charity, being benevolent, but rather recognizing the God-given rights of the poor and the needy and not trampling on those rights. So that is a duty of all kings and those in authority, to respect and honor the rights of the poor and the needy. I have no time to read these. You can read them when you get the recording. But just Lamentations 3, when all the prisoners of the land are crushed underfoot, when human rights are perverted in the presence of the Most High, when one's case is subverted, does the Lord not see it? So notice the language of human rights. Centuries before they were formally documented in human rights charters like the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So even though the Bible does not have what we might call a theory of justice, it is assumed that justice takes the form of giving people their God-given rights, economic and political. Now we know that Israel rejected her vocation, her mission. She wanted to be not the light to the nations, but she wanted to be like other nations. And so then we find in the New Testament, God bringing about a new Israel that is made up of Jew and Gentile. The basic confession of faith that made a man or woman a Christian, a Christian in the early church was a public confession at baptism that Jesus Christ is Lord. Not just that he is my Lord or that he is Lord of the church, but that this crucified Jesus, God has raised to the highest position in the universe, that all human history, all human cultures, the whole universe now comes under his authority. That every part of human life must acknowledge his rule, his liberating kingship. So the church then is a new kind of society that emerges on the other side of the cross. And it's a polis, an ecclesia, a called out people, a new political community in which Christ is breaking down the divisions, the barriers between Jew and Gentile, between male and female, between slave and free. And this new humanity gives its primary allegiance not to its kings and its presidents and its governors, or even to its ethnic communities or its biological family. This new community gives its allegiance to Jesus Christ. Which means that today, American Christians have to think of themselves firstly as Christians and not as Americans, let alone as Republicans or Democrats. Kenyan Christians must think of themselves first as Christians, not as Kenyans or even as Kikuyu or Luo or Maasai. Sri Lankan Christians are to think of themselves as Christians first and not Sri Lankans or as Tamils or Sinhalese or Burghers or whatever. So this is subversive revolutionary teaching with profound political implications. So yes, we have to work out the lordship of Christ within our cultural and ethnic and national contexts. How far are we loyal? How far are we disloyal? But our primary identity is that now we belong to a worldwide family, the global body of Christ. And this is spoken of as a sign, a foretaste, an instrument, if you like, of the new creation that God is going to bring about on the final day of judgment. And so this biblical narrative ends with a picture, not of us going back to that symbolic garden and a couple, but of us moving forward to a symbolic New Jerusalem, a city that comes down from heaven to transform the earth. So our future, our shalom, our salvation lies not in escaping the earth to some place we call heaven, but of heaven coming down to earth. And we read of the kings of the earth who represent all the civilizations and the cultures of the earth, bringing their treasures, everything that is true and good and just and beautiful in every human culture and civilization is not lost, but will be resurrected along with us, freed of their idolatrous and evil associations, and redirected to the worship of the Lamb who sits on the throne in the New Jerusalem. So this is a universal cosmic vision of personal, social, political transformation. The only thing that's missing, interestingly, in the New Jerusalem is religion. No place for religion. So let's get back to Romans 13. What did Paul the Apostle actually say? I mentioned that there has been a very common misinterpretation or misunderstanding of this text in history. People have assumed that it means that those who occupy some position of political authority have been put there by God, and therefore we as subjects of the state or as citizens must obey whatever directives or decrees that they issue. Now notice the pastoral context of the letter to the Romans. Like all Paul's letters or Peter's letters or John's letters, they are addressing specific pastoral questions. It was not obvious to the early Christians how they were to live as a sign of this new humanity, how they were to conduct themselves as Christ's people in relation to the social and political structures of their day. Think of patriarchal families, or household slave economies, or even the Roman Empire itself. Think of the church in Rome that is living at the very heart of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome itself. How are they to conduct themselves vis-a-vis the Roman authorities? Now, these are the questions that Paul is addressing. If you have a Bible near you, you might like to turn very quickly to Romans 13 and the opening verse. That every person, Paul says, be subject to the governing authorities, because there is no authority except what God has instituted. Now, Paul is not here referring to any particular Caesar. He's referring to the very institution of political authority, of governmental authority, and saying that all political authority, whatever form it may take, whether monarchies or democracies, where he didn't know much about democracy in his own day, but ultimately their authority derived from God. God had delegated such authority. So the implication is that those who now wield human authority are answerable. They're accountable to the one who has delegated that authority to them. Now, that's not how any Caesar thought of himself. He thought he was an absolute power, answerable to nobody. Now, 3 times in the first 6 verses of Romans 13, Paul refers to the Roman magistrates or the Roman police officers. Notice these are not Christians, they are pagan, unbelieving magistrates and police officers. He refers to them 3 times as God's servants. Twice in Greek he uses the word diakonoi, from which we get the English word deacon. The third time he speaks of liturgoi, from which we get the English word liturgy or worship. So Paul is saying that these pagan magistrates who are exercising their God-given authority are God's servants. They're worshiping God, provided they're doing their work in the way that God expects them to. So how does God expect them to do their work? He goes on to say it is to punish wrongdoing and it is to protect the innocent. So the task of government is fundamentally to protect innocent people so they can go about their daily lives without fear of violence, of arbitrary assault, and it is to punish wrongdoing. Now, obviously, governments cannot punish or restrain all wrongdoing. Sometimes when governments try to do that, they overreach and they create new wrongs, new evils to replace the old. Now, remember that Paul was a Jew, familiar with these Old Testament scriptures. And we've seen how the Old Testament law had a powerful bias towards the weak, the vulnerable, the defenseless, those who day in and day out were subjected to institutional or systemic wrongdoing. Not people who were just occasionally subject to violence or wrongdoing. But the poor, the widow, the orphan, the resident foreigner, they were all subject perhaps to institutional or what we today might call structural evil or wrongdoing. So I want to suggest that the primary or basic function of government is to address institutional or systemic wrongdoing, to render justice to all people within its borders. Now, Paul is not giving here a comprehensive theology of government or a political theory of government. He's not saying that this is all that governments do. We know that he was very grateful to the Roman state for their infrastructure development. He used the roads, the bridges that the Romans built in his missionary journeys. And we know today that governments also play an important coordinating activity to coordinate the activities of the diverse groups and individuals in society. So for a full-orbed theology of government, we need to read 2,000 years of Christian political reflection and then translate that or contextualize that in our own culture, in our own day and age. But I suggest that what Paul is giving here in these opening verses of Romans 13 is he's pointing us to the basic duty of government in all ages and in all cultures. And that is wherever governments do not punish wrongdoing, indeed where governments punish innocent people and protect wrongdoers, help them get away scot-free, do not bring them to justice, then Paul would say we don't have government. What we have is tyranny, and it's no different to banditry or to piracy on the high seas. And that is exactly what St. Augustine said in the 4th century in his book, The City of God, that a government that does not render justice to its people is no different to a bandit, a gang of bandits, or a gang of pirates. And they have to be opposed for the sake of restoring government. So then how should Christians respond when governments themselves become systemic wrongdoers, punishing innocent people, protecting the wrongdoers? Well, Paul himself gives an example from his own life. In Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas visit Philippi, which was a Roman colony settled by many veterans from the Roman army. When they preach the gospel, they are thrown into jail, they are tortured. You know how the story develops. There's an earthquake in the night, the prison doors are broken open, but instead of running away, they remain. The next day, the Roman authorities, the magistrates, come and demand that Paul and Silas leave the city. Paul and Silas refuse to obey the magistrates. They say we were Roman citizens, we were entitled to a fair trial. You denied us our right to a trial. You tortured us and you imprisoned us. Unless you publicly apologize for what you have done, we are not going to leave the city. Now, that is what we might today call civil disobedience. And Christians ought to be in the forefront of civil disobedience when it comes to unjust governments or tyrannical governments, to confront governments, to complain that our rights are being violated, not to stay silent and just grumble and complain behind their backs, but to publicly protest, to publicly confront the authorities. And when the authorities do such things, we are under no divine obligation to submit to them, to obey them. Also, there is Revelation 13, which needs to be read in conjunction with Romans 13. In Revelation 13, the Roman state is pictured as a beast that is waging war against the Christian church, but not only against the Christian church, because in Revelation 17 and 18, that beast is depicted as sucking into itself, into the very heart of Rome, all peoples and all the economic resources of the provinces of the empire. This is a state that has become idolatrous, that is demanding that people worship it as if it were God. And an idolatrous state that puts itself in the place of God is a demonic state. This is where the state has become demonized. And this is there in Revelation 13, as opposed to Romans 13, where when Paul was writing, the Roman state had not yet become demonized. A brief historical digression about the rule of law that I mentioned earlier in the Old Testament. This is Thomas Aquinas, famous Christian philosopher, theologian, writing on kingship. He says, if to provide itself with a king belongs to a given multitude, it is not unjust that the king be deposed or have his power restricted by that same multitude, if becoming a tyrant he abuses his royal power. He goes on, a scheme should be carefully worked out, which would prevent the multitude ruled by a king from falling into the hands of a tyrant. So what he's suggesting is the beginnings of what we call constitution writing, or coming up with documents like the Magna Carta in the 13th century, or a Bill of Rights that put various checks and balances on power, so that kings don't just wake up in the morning and then decide what is good for their people, but they rule under the authority of law. Now, the Christian church has made massive contributions to developing the rule of law. And Christian theologians have spoken of 4 kinds of law. There is divine law, which is the law that God has revealed to his people. There is natural law, which is the law that exists, if you like, the moral order in the world, which we can discern by the exercise of our human reason, built into our human nature. But because our human nature is fallen, our reason is twisted by sin, it's often difficult to discern, although we have, all human beings, an intuitive sense of justice, of fair play. We know that it's wrong to break promises. We know that we should care for children and not abuse them. We know that we should not steal the property of another. So although we might disagree across cultures and in different ages as to how we define theft or promises or contracts, yet there is this intuitive sense that is built into human nature that we call natural law. But because of our fallen human reason, we make many mistakes. We don't discern accurately natural law, which is why sometimes we've thought that the subjugation of women, or that some races were born to rule while other races were born to serve, we've assumed that that was all part of a natural order. The third area is of international law. The law that exists between empires or between nations. The Latin theologians of Latin Christendom call jus gentium, the law of nations. Remember that until about 100 years ago, the vast majority of people everywhere and in human history lived not within nation states, but within empires. And Christian thinkers sought to put curbs or limits on empires, to say that empires also had to follow laws when it comes to military engagement. So they developed a just war tradition, that certain military practices, certain exercises in warfare were forbidden. So later human rights also came to be included within international law, or the law of the oceans. Or today we have laws to protect asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, laws to protect the environment or indigenous communities. Here is Oliver O'Donovan, a well-known Christian political theologian in Britain, who writes, the theological impulse behind the conception of international law is altogether superior to the theology of empire. It acknowledges the claim of Christ to be the sole ruler of the nations, avoids erecting an icon of world government in his place, and yet Christ's rule over the nations is not left as an empty ideal, but is given a clear institutional witness. And the fourth area, of course, is positive law. That is the law that is created in legislative assemblies, national assemblies, and parliaments. But all positive law must come under international law and natural law. And if we're Christians, we also think of divine law as it is refracted through natural law and international law. Now, all of us in our nation states, we live in pluralist societies. My country is very pluralistic, but yours too, even though Christians may number, 70–75% of Kenyans, yet there are significant Muslim and Hindu communities and people who follow African traditional religions. So all our nation states are characterized by religious and ethnic or cultural pluralism. And so when a Christian occupies a position in such a government, he or she should see his or her role not as there to protect or provide for the Christian community, but rather to ensure that the rights and the privileges of citizenship reach all people, all communities within that nation state. So I'm very grateful that we in Sri Lanka, we don't have a Christian political party, for example, even though there are Buddhist political parties and Muslim political parties, because we Christians have said publicly, openly, that we are concerned not just to defend and protect the Christian community, but we care for all communities, for all citizens who live on this land. And that is how Christians should demonstrate their uniqueness. But apart from religious and ethnic pluralism, there is also what we call associational pluralism. And those are those social units that lie between the naked individual at one extreme and the naked state at the other. The basic unit is the family unit, which has its own authority, structure. There are clubs, there are professional associations, there are schools, there are universities, there's the mass media. There are think tanks, there are NGOs, there are charities. So the state is only one authority amongst other authorities. Admittedly, the state is the authority of last resort. It's the authority that we appeal to whenever there is conflict between these other authorities. But the state must respect the independence of all these other authorities or spheres of life. Here is Abraham Kuyper, a former Dutch prime minister, a committed Christian philosopher, who writes, a people which abandons to state supremacy the right of a family, or a university which abandons to the state the right of science, is just as guilty before God as a nation which lays its hands upon the rights of the magistrates. And thus the struggle for liberty is not only declared permissible, but is made a duty for each individual in his or her own sphere. Here is Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who died last year, whose books have been a great help to me. He was a chief Jewish rabbi of the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth. He says, we must protect social space, by which I mean not only parks, public gardens, beaches, and forests, but also universities, professional associations, NGOs, charities, and churches. These are neutral spaces where we leave politics and prejudice outside the door, like shoes when we enter sacred ground. Because they are neutral spaces, they heal, they bridge difference, they bring people together who would not otherwise meet except in competition. A society without neutral spaces would be like a city without trees, efficient perhaps, but ugly and ultimately unbearable or unlivable. So we come back to Romans 13. What Paul has argued for is what we would call a protectionist view of the state, as opposed to a perfectionist view of the state. The ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle believed in a perfectionist view. They believed that one of the duties of the state was to create moral, virtuous citizens. Now, Paul doesn't say that. He doesn't expect the Roman state to ever make us moral, virtuous citizens, because only Christ and the gospel can do that. And wherever the state tries to legislate morality, tries to make us moral citizens according to its understanding of morality, it ends up as a totalitarian state. The Soviet Union in the last century was the most famous example of all communist governments. Or today, think of Iran or Saudi Arabia or North Korea. Those are perfectionist states. Paul is arguing for a protectionist state that protects people's rights. And so as Christians, it's important that we learn to distinguish morality and law. Yes, the law needs a moral foundation. Without a moral foundation, law loses its credibility, its plausibility, its hold on people. But we know that whatever is moral cannot just be translated into law. Idolatry is immoral, adultery is immoral, greed is immoral, vanity is immoral. But do we want to see laws that criminalize idolatry and adultery and greed and vanity? There can be laws that are illegal, but which are not necessarily immoral, like many of the laws in an apartheid state, that blacks and whites should not marry. That was considered legal, but we as Christians regard that as immoral. Here is an American Christian philosopher, John Warwick Montgomery, whose words we need to heed. He says, our task is not to correct every moral failing by human legislation. We are rather to legislate where probable harm to the body politic will arise in the absence of law. Thus, we must prosecute stealing, but not profanity, perjury and misrepresentation of the terms of a contract, but not lying in general, child abuse. Why? Because children are vulnerable and defenseless, but not the teaching of atheism. Murder, but not belief in witchcraft. God is still in his heaven. The evils we are powerless to correct in accordance with his word, he will most assuredly remedy on the last day. So yes, it is right that Christians should seek through rational persuasion to argue for a Christian moral stance on public issues, but not try to use the coercive apparatus of the state to impose their view on others. And when we argue, for example, against abortion, it should not be by quoting biblical texts or giving theological arguments that are not recognized by non-Christians. We can argue against abortion using our knowledge of human embryology, combined with the discourse of human rights, the right to life of every human person from conception to the grave. That is how we need to argue. So we distinguish morality and law, we respect pluralism, diversity in a society. We need to treat others the way that we would like to be treated. This is what Jesus taught his disciples. Do unto others what you would like them to do unto you. So just like we wouldn't want to see in a Muslim majority country, an Islamic state, to see ayatollahs or Muslim clerics ruling us, because then we would feel as Christians that we are second-class citizens. In the same way, we should not try to bring about a Christian state. We shouldn't encourage Christian priests or bishops to occupy positions in government, because then they would be perceived by Muslims and atheists and Buddhists and others as actually being biased towards the Christian community. And these people who are not Christians will be made to feel that they are second-class citizens. Moreover, in Ephesians 4, Paul argues that God has given pastors or priests, teachers, presbyter priests, in order to equip the people of God, the laity, so-called, for works of service, of ministry, like the Roman magistrates or the Roman police officers. So it is us, the so-called laity, who should be doing works of public service in government, in business, in the universities, in the judiciaries, in the mass media, not Christian priests and pastors. Their calling is to equip us so that we go about the daily business, the day-to-day business of government as their members of parliament. So if there are priests and bishops who feel that they must now occupy positions of government, they need to resign as bishops and priests. I suggest that they have failed in their primary calling, which is to equip the people of God to be actively involved in government. Like I said at the beginning, they can still be active in politics as opposed to being active in government in the way that Oscar Romero or Martin Luther King or Desmond Tutu gave political prophetic leadership to their nations, but not in the day-to-day running of governments. And so finally, I encourage all Christian graduates, young graduates, that as they climb up the social ladder, that they should still have friends amongst the poor across cultural or tribal divides, that they should retain those friendships with people who are left behind, who are on the social margins. That would make them rooted in the reality of our societies. How I wish that politicians from time to time would leave their cars behind and use public transport. Or when they fall sick, use public state hospitals and not private hospitals. Because if politicians, especially our Christian politicians, were to do that from time to time, our public services, our hospitals, our public schools, our public transport will dramatically improve. So let me end with two quotations from two prominent Christian political philosophers or theologians. Duncan Forrester, who served as a missionary for some years in India. A democracy, he writes, needs an active citizenry that's willing to put the common good before sectional and individual interests, and sometimes make sacrifices for the benefit of others and for a greater good. Usually this is only possible when many people are gripped by a vision and feel a sense of solidarity, shared destiny, and mutual accountability. But it also depends on visionary leadership. For political leaders who have convictions which they can share, and a vision, a dream of the society that is infectious, like Martin Luther King's or Desmond Tutu's. James Skillen, an American Christian political philosopher. Civil society cannot save a people from oppressive, unjust governments, but neither can such governments be changed without the emergence of a sense of civic purpose and the ability of citizens to mobilize in order to reform or replace oppressive governments. For the latter to occur, people need to become politically literate, publicly engaged, and willing to act in the public interest. So when governments fail, government failure is a symptom of other failures. It's because other institutions like the judiciary or professional associations have become corrupted. The schooling system has failed, or the moral formation of citizens has failed. And that is where the church and perhaps other religious communities stand indicted. So thank you.